Welcome to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversities, or AVA's, webinar series. This is what we're calling Webinar Wednesdays because we host a webinar pretty much every Wednesday, and we'll hope that you'll join us for those. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yursich. With AVA, I'm an early career researcher and lead on the webinar series, along with my colleagues Andrea and Jason, who are here with us today. In my other roles, I am the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children, and faculty in sociology and criminology at Capilano University. Before we dive into content, I do want to acknowledge that on a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous people of the land on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and their rights and responsibilities in culture, language, and the pursuit of wellness. Just a couple of procedural notes before we begin. The session is being recorded, so you'll be able to access this at a later date and you'll be able to share it with friends. And throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A function, which you find on the bottom of your screen, to pose questions for our speakers, which we'll make time to discuss with Andrea and with Carrie at near the end of the webinar during the Q&A portion. And without further ado, I'm very excited to bring you here today for a webinar entitled Innovation at the Back of the Bus with our speakers Andrea Silverstone and Carrie McManus from SAGES Domestic Violence Prevention Society. By way of introduction, and I'll make it brief, Andrea is the CEO of SAGES, an organization committed to disrupting systems of abuse. She has led the development of innovation programs and policies addressing domestic violence or domestic and sexual abuse, including understudied communities like women of affluence and the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. Her leadership has driven impactful initiatives, including Provincial Collective Impact Project, a primary prevention framework, and advocacy for Clare's Law in Alberta. The co-speaker, Carrie McManus, is the Director of Innovation and Programs at SAGES, where she breaks down barriers and drives change. Her passion for eradicating domestic abuse fuels her innovation approach to developing initiatives that challenge beliefs and empower communities. Under her leadership, SAGES has expanded to address domestic abuse in rural and remote areas, sex work, and underserved communities. Andrea, Carrie, thank you for joining us today. I'm so excited about your talk and to learn more about your work. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very
Awesome.
much.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm gonna just get myself set up. My computer has decided to have a bit of a fit today. So hopefully this works. Can everybody see the presentation?
Not yet. Now we can.
Okay, perfect. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. And if you're not here live, for watching this recording later, we're so excited to be here and to be chatting with you today about innovation and disruption and this book we wrote.
So we wrote a book. During COVID, Carrie and I had the experience. The slides are a little bit slow, Carrie. I'm not sure what's going on.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to help that. I'm sorry.
Okay. Anyways, we wrote a book. During COVID, SAGES had a very interesting experience, which was that as other organizations were struggling to be able to meet the very quickly changing climate that we were in, SAGES felt very well poised to be able to meet that challenge. And part of it was because for years, SAGES had been investing in and engaging in innovation in a very deliberate and mindful way. And so over the course of COVID, we had a lot of learnings about our experiences of innovation. We did a deep dive into a more purposeful way of being able to describe what innovation was in the civil society sector, both for ourselves as well as for our staff and for our sector. And so we wrote a book, but we began writing it during COVID. So this has been a real passion project that has taken us quite a while.
And also means that we have all of these hilarious, funny memories of writing in Andrea's garage, which we set up as an outdoor living room with these crazy industrial heaters that probably we shouldn't have been running in an indoor space, and just being absolutely frozen, but sitting there and working on the book and talking through all of it. So there's lots of interesting memory associated with the content and the theory of this. So if you've read the book or seen the book, or if you've heard Andrea and I speak in our times of um, being less professional talking about our research, you may have heard the name Candy McStone. And so I guess the question is, Andrea, who is Candy McStone?
Well, Candy McStone is our alter ego. And so if for anyone that can't figure it out, it's Carrie McManus and Andrea Silverstone, and we became Candy McStone. But essentially, Candy McStone is this amazing collaboration that we have created that allows us to engage with curiosity and bravery. And we're going to talk about those values in innovation. And I think it also has allowed us to synergistically grow how we see and how we understand innovation. And we're going to talk a little bit about this later, but we think that a big part of being able to engage in this work is, if not having a cohort of people around you engage in the work with you, at least to have one person who is really supporting you through it, because innovation work is hard. And when I say hard, I don't just mean hard because often you have to fight the status quo, where you have to try and have thought experiments that encourage you to think about things in new and disruptive ways. But it's also hard emotionally. And so to have a partner that you can go through it with makes a very big difference. And so that is who Candy McStone is. And of course, we have to have fun while we're doing it.
So probably lots of you are thinking about, innovation. It's like the big buzzword. People are talking about innovation a lot. I would suggest that people are talking about innovation more now than they were even when we started writing the book. It's become kind of the latest thing. I liken it to when I first started in the sector, we were going through a trauma-informed practice sort of renaissance of everybody was talking about trauma-informed practice. But what did that actually mean, and weren't we already actually doing all of that? And so when I think about innovation, I think about, innovation as a buzzword, innovation as an idea. And how is it different for us? When I think about innovation for us, and what is really the grounding for us, is that innovation is actually about a framework and a mindset in how we do all of our work. So not just an innovative project, an idea that we have, something new that we want to try, or some new research, but innovation is the framework that I use and that we encourage our staff and our teams to use in everything that they do, in every problem that we come up against, in every client conversation that we have. We have this framework of starting from a place of innovation, figuring out how to engage in that sort of mindset of that willingness to fail, and that idea of being able to really connect into the values that drive us, the way that we show up as humans in our work, and how all of that impacts what we do moving forward. And so for me, when I think about innovation and why it's different than the sort of buzz of innovation that happens now and gets talked about often within a framework for the tech sector, I think for me, that's what feels different about this.
Yeah, I think that, just to sort of put it in a way that I often think about it, is we don't compartmentalize innovation. It's something that is an ingredient that is infused in every bit of work that we do, which also means that we have to be very clear, and we're going to talk about this, of our values that guide us. Because if we don't have clarity in the values that guide us, and we don't have clarity also in the grounding of our why, then I think it's really easy to get lost in the buzz of innovation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is, I think, the first bit of grounding.
I was going to say, this might be my favorite slide of all the slides.
So this is the very first bit of grounding that we actually think needs to happen. It's almost like the pre-existing things that need to be in place in order for innovation to be able to happen. And so the reason we call it the feels UG, and if you read our book, you'll see this is in many ways the hardest chapter that we had to write ourselves, as well as the hardest part of innovation for ourselves. And so the reason we call it the feels UG, and if you read our book, you'll see this is in many ways the hardest chapter that we had to write ourselves, as well as the hardest part of innovation for ourselves. And so the reason we call it the feels UG, and if you read our book, you'll see this is in many ways the hardest part of innovation for ourselves, as well as the hardest part of innovation for ourselves. And so innovation is really challenging emotionally. Innovation challenges us to admit sometimes that what we've been doing hasn't been working, no matter how hard we've been trying at it. Innovation, I think, also challenges us to think about scary futures that we might not want to envision or think about. And I think also innovation requires us to be secure in attachment to our organizations, to ourselves, to our communities, because I think if in any way we feel threatened in those attachments or disorganized in those attachments, we stop making decisions based on an openness to wherever innovation is going to lead us, and we start to hold on to things because of emotional responses.
One of the things that we talk about in the book, which is, totally an idea that we have borrowed from many amazing innovators and people around us, which is the idea of the tipping point. And I think, when we talk about tipping points within our work, we often talk about them from the perspective of, what's happening in the environment around us. Some could argue we're living through a tipping point right now in terms of the political climate that we find ourselves in. But what was interesting as we were thinking about this and thinking about how our own emotional journeys are part of this, we were able to really think about what are the tipping points for us personally within this work that allow us to actually be able to sit in innovation, and to be able to embrace all of those things that Andrea was talking about, the sort of the pieces that come around us. And so I share a story in the book about my own personal tipping point of the sort of recognition of what are the pieces that I can bring forward, and then what are the pieces that I actually cannot bring forward, and what does that mean if I actually can't be the person that can solve all of these things, as somebody who thinks I'm super smart and very capable, and what does that do to me, right? What is that tipping point allow for me to be willing to step into? Or if I'm not willing to process that, what does that actually mean in terms of how I then would move forward and present myself and engage with myself?
Yeah, I think that at the end of the day, it's about a lot of consciousness. And I think that also part of the Candy McStone ingredient in the feels is I think that Carrie and I both hold each other accountable to that consciousness. And we also explore that consciousness with each other. One of the conversations we often have is, why do we feel the drive for innovation? What has created in us that experience? And where else in our lives has that echoed and resonated?
Although sometimes instead of saying it from a theoretical place, we say, why? What is wrong with us that we are doing this? That may be just in a moment of burnout. So
So
go
I'll
ahead.
let you start with it, Carrie.
Okay. So why isn't the civil society sector more innovative? So I want to start this. I was looking at LinkedIn this morning, and I was seeing different people posting about different things that they're doing, different initiatives, new ideas, different virtual or text-based platforms that are being used. And so I want to start by saying what part of what we're talking about here is not to say that nobody's doing anything innovative, and aren't we all terrible? There is lots of amazing pockets of innovative work that is happening within the social service sector. And I think that, we have seen that over the years. We have seen that since COVID. And I think we will continue to see that as we go through this current sort of phase that we happen to be in. But when we think in general about the idea of innovation, the idea of risk taking, the idea of being willing to fail, one of the things that I often think about is I sort of harken back to this idea of the social responsibility that we feel like we have as the civil society sector to prevent harm from happening to the people that we work with, to the communities that we serve, within the lens of our work and how we do that work. And I think that that is a really powerful starting place for the kind of work that we want to be doing, to be really conscious of what is it that we want to do, what are we trying to accomplish, what is the world we're hoping to help to co-create for communities and for individuals. But when our fear of hurting people or causing harm stops us from actually even exploring what harm looks like to the communities that we work with or to the individuals, we start to let our own fears as service providers, as outsiders sometimes to the work that we're doing, as people who have professional designations and have insurance companies, insurance that we have, and have organizations that say you can't do this or you can't do this. Those things start to cloud in to what and how we think about innovation, or what and how we think about the how far can we go in the work that we're doing, because we have all of these things that can very easily kind of hold us back. And I think that in that idea of the holding us back, what often ends up happening is that instead of operating from a practice or a mindset of innovation, we end up operating from a mindset of scarcity. And in scarcity, scarcity can mean we don't have the money to do innovation, or we don't have the money to try new projects. But scarcity is also a mindset of we can't step outside of this thing that we know that we have 100% proof is going to be effective, or that we have 100% proof isn't going to cause harm. Because I actually don't think that we make choices in the civil society sector based off of the idea of 100% effective. I think we make choices based off the idea of 100% won't cause harm, or won't have a level of risk that feels intolerable for us. And I think that scarcity, we were talking before the webinar started, scarcity is like an easy thing to be in. And especially now in our political climate and our funding climate, I find myself stepping into scarcity at moments, in a way that I'm not used to. But I would just want to acknowledge that scarcity is a real thing, and there are ways that it protects us in times where in our sector it's really challenging and it's really hard. But when we operate always from a place of scarcity, it leads us to a place where we aren't looking up and out for innovation. We aren't practicing from that place of what other opportunities are there? How could we look at this different? How could we future plan? But we practice from we just have all of these problems in front of us right now, and we have to solve all of these problems. And once we solve all of these problems, then we can think about looking out externally. And of course, when we put our head down and we solve the problems, every client you serve, there's going to be another client to come in to serve after that. And so it becomes this sort of perpetuated loop of not creating space or the opportunity to look up and to look out.
I think the other thing that we have to be very aware of the limitations of why we struggle in the civil society sector with innovation is the systems that surround us. One of the things that we talk about in the book is Simon Sinek's work around the infinite game. But I think that the systems around us, whether there are funders, whether there are donors, whether there are boards of directors, they are all directing us into a finite game where we have to report on quarterly outcomes, yearly outcomes. And as we know, human beings don't change in that way, and human beings don't evolve and don't have success in those ways. And so as long as we're being forced into a finite game where we're living in an infinite world, we're going to find ourselves being challenged to being able to innovate, because the systems around us aren't going to allow us to engage in that infinite game. And the infinite game also means that it's less static than the finite games. There's ups, there's downs, sometimes there's success, sometimes there's failure. But hopefully with each iteration, we're moving forward to a better solution or a better society. But you need frameworks around you to support that. One of the things I talk about in the book is CJS's board of directors. And early on in my career with them, I had a fairly big failure, and I was fairly sure that it was going to lead to me and CJS parting ways. And in fact, the board treated it very differently. They treated it as a growth opportunity and an innovation opportunity, which then I think led me to feel safe to engage even more in innovation. But I think many CEOs don't have a system of support from a board of directors or from funders or anyone else around them that actually supports the engagement and innovation.
So Andrea, you bring up a really good topic, which is that how do we actually foster more innovation and a more innovative sector? And I think that, we're going to talk a little bit about some of those technical things that we think are really valuable and really important in doing that, and having a board of directors. For myself, having a CEO that holds that space. I can remember calling Andrea one day pretty early on in my career, and I had been at a presentation and I had said something that I was pretty sure people weren't going to be super happy about. And I called her and said, just so you know, I just said this thing. And if somebody calls you, I did it. It's me. It was me. And I was really scared to have that conversation with her, because I've had previous bosses where I said I just said this thing and people are mad at me. And he said, well, why did you piss them off? And Andrew said, okay, I got it. And there was just this total different sort of feeling. And so I think, we'll talk a little bit about that. But I think that, fostering a more innovative sector, I think, part of what I think about is getting really, really clear. We've talked about our own personal feels, the Uggs, the getting clear about that. I think organizationally and sector wise, we have to be really clear about our mission and our vision. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to help people who are currently being harmed, or are we trying to prevent harm from happening? And I think that, for us, for me in the work that I do, when I started to think about our work differently, when I started to change that of, we're not trying to help people who are harmed, we're trying to prevent harm, which part of preventing harm means helping people who are currently harmed so that it prevents future experiences of that, but it also opens up these other opportunities in these other sort of spaces. And I think that, for us, one of the things that we often talk about when we think about sort of fostering a more innovative sector is, what does it look like to really think about stepping into fear of failure? What is our risk tolerance for that? How do we define failure and start to create opportunities for exploring that in a way that still doesn't cause harm to people, but in a way that allows us to learn things and to take on new information that then can be used in terms of how we look at and think about and engage within our sector.
So I think we're going to talk throughout this about how to engage and foster a more innovative sector. But I think that one of the things that for me in the book is actually really important are the cast of characters that help you to foster a more innovative sector. One of the things, as Carrie was talking about, that I was thinking about was one of our cast of characters is our worthy rival. Also, that terminology taken from Simon Sinek's work, Haider Hassan, who at the time was the head of the CEO of Immigrant Services Calgary, who did some very radical moves when he moved into the position of the CEO there to try and make it the very best organization for immigrants who were coming into Calgary in the very best way that he could. And I remember going out for coffee with him and him saying to me, in the same way that Carrie said to me, I think some people are going to be angry at me. I think he said, I think some people are going to be angry at me. And I think if you don't have those relationships to be able to sit down and for someone to say, yeah, people are going to be angry at you, but you're doing the right thing. Because I think that we get really, really focused on one particular outcome, which is just making sure that we don't put people in any more danger than they're in, versus sometimes looking at the bigger outcome of how do we stop the danger in the first place.
Absolutely. So, Andrea, why in the book do we talk about values so much?
Well, because we work so hard to create them. So I think that one of the things that
this would be great if we had sound effects, because then I could do like a ching, cymbal crash sound.
Yeah,
that's what I imagined in my head.
So one of the things that we realized early on in this work is that two things. One, we had a set of values that was guiding us, and two, it wasn't articulated. And that if you want everyone to be on the bus with you, having, you know, as we talk about an innovation in the back of the bus, but we want everyone on the bus with us. It's really important to know what the bus is. And essentially the bus is our values. And so it's really important to articulate our values so that we're able to share them with our staff, with our stakeholders, with our clients, with the people that we're trying to support change for, so that we're all on the same page. The other thing is that innovation is a hard decision tree. There's often really hard decisions that you have to make as you go forward, and sometimes really heart-wrenching decisions that you need to make. And I think that when you're able to fall back on your values and use them as the guideline as for what innovation looks like, then I think that it helps you to move faster through innovation. It also helps you to move more cleanly through innovation, although one of our values is trusting in the messiness. Then I think it also helps you to move more collaboratively through innovation. You know, I often think about innovation that's happening in the tech world or in the medical world, and those are innovations that are also sometimes innovations that challenge ethics. And it's always really important for those people that are doing those sort of innovations to have really clear values around their ethics, you know, things like cloning and stem cell research and all of those things. And I think that we have the same obligation and the same imperative to have those same ethics surrounding us. And I think that you could almost interchangeably talk about our values as being our ethical imperatives as we engage in innovation.
And I always like to talk about when we're talking about values that, you know, the four that are on the screen are the Say Yes values that we did a co-creation process many years ago with our staff and our teams to figure out what those were. They're not the be all and end all. This isn't about taking our values and saying, well, these are the values that lead us to innovation. It is about figuring out for yourselves what are your own values that lead you to innovation. Most people may not like a value of trust in the messiness. It is my like happy place. It's the thing that makes me the most excited about any of the pieces of work, but it doesn't have to be for everybody. And so it is about really being able to articulate for yourself what are the values, you know, as Andrea said, what is the sort of ethical rooting of the work that we're doing? Why are we here doing it in the way that we're doing it? And being really clear and foundational on that is going to be really helpful. So let's take a minute and sort of talk, now that we've talked about a bunch of stuff, let's go back and talk about what are some of the sort of definitions, right? So again, innovation has become this buzzword. Everybody's talking about it. It often gets used in reference to the tech sector and tech startups. And so what does it actually mean, right? When we think about and talk about innovation within Say Yes, again, we're talking about this from the perspective of a mindset, not of an activity necessarily. So if you think about innovation from a mindset perspective, really what we're looking at is those sort of new way of doing things. And the mindset of innovation becomes every problem that you look at provides the opportunity to say, is this the best way that we could be doing this? Or are we doing this way because we've always done it this way? And therefore, we've just never stopped to think that actually we have 5 steps in between, and we could actually just have 1 step, right? And so the mindset of looking at new ways of doing things and of improving the current things that we're doing. So when we talk about innovation at Say Yes, we talk about different levels of innovation. Not all innovation is going to lead to the thing that figures out for us how to crack the nut of eradicating domestic abuse. Some innovation is going to make it so that our admin team takes 2 steps as opposed to 7 steps. That's great. All of those innovations have space and value. And when you think about it from a mindset perspective, as opposed to from a project's perspective or an activity perspective, then you start to see that actually we're not trying to quantify innovation. We're actually just trying to have it as a normal part of how we engage and how we operate. The other thing that we talk, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say the other thing that we talk about often that I think in some ways goes hand in hand with innovation. It doesn't necessarily, but I think it's in some ways it does, is this idea of disruption. And so I can remember when Say Yes was going through our name change many, many years ago, and we were figuring out, you know, how do we actually articulate the thing that is who we are and what we do and what we believe. And one of the things that that came up, I remember we came up across this word of disruption. And I said to our comms person at the time, I want to use disruption here. And I know you're going to tell me I can't, but I need you to find another word that sort of talks about this in the same way of this like idea of radical change. And she said, no, I'm okay with it. And I still feel floored, obviously, to this day, because I remember that one unique conversation. But I think that when I think about, when we think about innovation and we say it's a mindset, it's not an activity, the disruption is for us part of the driver of some of those pieces of innovation for us, which is the ability to look at what is the thing that we're trying to achieve. And if we stay on this path, does that actually get us there? Or if we're planning for this different future, do we actually have to do radical change in order to come to this new future that we want to be in and that we want to be looking at?
Just to give everyone an idea of the difference between innovation and disruption, and you'll notice the example also on the previous slide. So if you think about, we came to a realization, and the realization was that, and the realization came about because of a publication from Stats Canada that said most people who experience domestic abuse, in fact, only about 35% of people who experience domestic abuse go to social service agencies or social service supports. So our question became, well, where are the other 65% of the people going? And so our innovation response to that was, we probably need to connect people to the supports that they usually go to, which is not formal supports. But our disruption is how do we actually focus on how do we recognize that we have an entire sector system that is entirely built around people talking to social supports in order to get help with domestic violence. And actually, the whole system and sector has been built in a way that probably doesn't actually meet the need of the population. And so innovation is, I think, the first bit of the realization and saying, okay, how can we tweak this? Whereas disruption is saying, what's a systemic approach here where we can shift everything to actually make it align with the information that we now have or the research that we now have.
And so for us, when we think about why do that, like why choose to engage in that within our organization, I think that, there's all of these sort of little reasons, right? It allows us to be really, really relevant in the work that we're doing. If we're thinking about this always from this perspective of what do we know, what do we hear, and how does that then change or impact the way that we work? It helps us to, differentiate ourselves from others. It helps us to grow as an organization. It absolutely supports our resilience. And Andrea, started by talking about our experiences of COVID and how our organization was able to be resilient so quickly and so thoroughly because of this sort of this backbone that we have. And we believe, and this is our belief, you don't have to agree, but we believe that disruption and innovation is the only way to really tackle these intractable problems. I often look at this and think, we're 40 years in to solving a problem, and we've figured things out. Absolutely, we've made impact. We've positively impacted people who are experiencing domestic abuse. We've positively impacted communities. Absolutely. But we haven't figured out how to solve this issue yet. We've been looking at the existing playbook, the existing idea of what this is, and we haven't cracked that nut yet. And so for me, I think disruption is the way to be able to get there and to be able to do that.
So in 2016, the board of directors of SAGES decided that we should stop having innovation as something off the side of a bunch of people's desks and have it as a dedicated activity. And part of it being a dedicated activity meant dedicating funding towards it. And I know that 2 to 4% of an annual budget sounds small, but it's as your budget grows, the innovation budget grows. And at the time, 2 to 4% of our budget was about $40,000. $40,000 to be able to just play around with innovation meant that all of a sudden we could do something we never did before, was research in a way that actually connected us to emerging knowledge, not research that was coming out, you know, with all due respect to all of the academics in the room and to myself, as well as someone who's doing my PhD, research that comes out, you know, sometimes years after the research has been finished because it's finally made its way to a peer review journal. And so what we actually were able to do with some of that funding was to go to jurisdictions in the world that were doing really innovative work and facing those irretractable issues in ways that no one had ever faced them before. And since we have dedicated about 2 to 4% of our annual budget to innovation, our budget has actually grown by 35%. So it's actually an amazing return on our investment. And the other thing that I would say is that our innovation agenda has actually as well helped us to retain staff that we might not have otherwise been able to retain, which has also led us as an organization, I think, to have a healthier culture and a lower turnover rate. And so I think that there's a lot of benefits to that financial investment, but I think that you need a very visionary board of directors who's willing to say, we're raising undesignated dollars for innovation, because so often what we're trying to do, and this goes back to why the civil society sector struggles so much with innovation, is we're often just trying to raise undesignated dollars to fill holes in the budget to deal with the influx of clients that are walking through our doors, or to top off salaries that are often underfunded, and we want to make sure that our staff are being paid in equitable ways. And so I think it was a very brave decision, but I think it was a decision that actually led us to all of the growth that we wanted, both around dealing with the issue and addressing the issue of domestic and sexual violence and sexual exploitation, but also creating a stronger and healthier HR culture in our organization.
So what are some of the ways that innovation actually shows up at Sage Us, and that we actually practice in it and talk about it? So I've talked about this already in terms of the idea of mindset. And we are guided in this work by the work of Carol Dweck in her book around mindset and growth mindset, and really thinking about, if we engage in innovation, if we have an innovation mindset and approach the work that we do from that perspective, then it really shifts and changes how we think about and talk about and experience failure within the organization. It shifts us from saying, oh my God, I tried this thing and I failed, and therefore I'm going to put the whole thing on the shelf, or I'm going to be in trouble, or I'm going to have caused harm, to thinking about, okay, well, how do we do this better next time? What do we learn from this experience that we might label failure? What do we take from that? What do we learn from that? And then how do we incorporate that learning into the new activity or the new idea moving forward? One of the things that I often talk about with our staff team as we do research projects, both informal and formal research projects, is that sometimes the only outcome that we're looking for in a research project is learning. And I think it's really valuable to start when we start our project by talking about that, right? What are the outcomes? Well, the outcomes might be that we want to know if this thing is successful or not, but the outcome also is, I want information. I don't care if it's not successful. I care to know why it's not successful. What did we think we knew that actually we were incorrect about, so that we can take that knowledge, learn more if we need to, fill in more gaps, and then try again the next time, starting from 15 paces ahead, because we've learned all of this new information. And so when you think about that kind of perspective, it's really, really powerful, not just for Andrea and I to have those perspectives within the work that we do and how we approach our engagement with communities and research and all of that, but we sit in a place of privilege. And so in some ways, it's really easy for Andrea and I to have that perspective. But it's really, really powerful and really important for my frontline staff to have that perspective. That when they're doing things, when they say, I have this new idea of how I want to support volunteers, we say, great, what do we want to learn from that? How are we going to engage in that? And then when we try it, and say we try holding a wellness event and no volunteers show up, that instead of the staff feeling like, well, I failed because we did this whole thing and nobody wanted to do it, we say, okay, well, what did we learn? We learned that actually volunteers don't want to come to a thing on a Tuesday night. They'd rather something else. And then we take that knowledge and we move it into the next thing that we do and the next thing that we do. So part of how we see this and how we engage in this within our work at Sage S is we sort of break it into three kind of core columns here. So our idea of how do we grow and engage a resilient culture. Organizational culture is super, super valuable and super important to us. How do we use that to be able to ensure that our staff are getting the things that they need? And so we've built these tools internally in terms of how we check in on the culture of the organization. We have culture mapping that each of our teams do, where they talk about what does it mean? How do we show up in failure? How do we know that? How do we have psychological safety so that we know that we can do that? How do we allow ourselves to move fast? How do we know when we're moving too fast? And how do we know when we're moving too slow? We also talk a lot about the sort of capacity and transmitting of values. So again, we have these sort of core books that we talk about within the organization that have really grounded a lot of our work. We talk about this in the book. We're currently running a pilot within the org around these 4 sort of idea statements that are kind of taking from all of the different books and podcasts and different conversations we've had and distilling down to say, actually, we have kind of these 4 things that are really core to us. One of them being, we're a developmental organization that believes in building the plane as we fly it. And so that's an easy thing to say, but what does that actually mean? And so we spend time with our staff actually workshopping through, what does that look like? What does that feel like? What does it actually feel like when you realize that you're in a plane and you don't have any wings and you need to try to do something that you require wings for? And so it's helpful because I think it gives space for the staff to talk about what their experience is of that, and to be able to say sometimes this is really hard, and for us to say, yeah, of course it is. Let's hold space for that. And again, that goes to the culture piece and that psychological safety. And then all of that is really grounded in a feedback informed culture. And we take feedback informed from our clinical tools and our clinical work that we do, and the clinical model built by Scott Miller and Barry Duncan. But when I think about feedback informed, we think about it in terms of the whole of the organization, right? If we try things and it's not working, we need to know so that we can make shifts and adjustments to that. The greatest sign, the theory behind feedback informed, the treatment model, is that the greatest sign of success between a client and a clinician is their ability to give and receive feedback. And I think about that in terms of our staff as well, that the greatest sign of success is our ability to give and receive feedback, and for that feedback to be acted on. So if somebody says to me, actually, this is really important that we show up in this way at this time, that I listen to that and respond to that, and not say, okay, great, and then pretend like it never happened and kind of just move on.
So one of the things that we really struggled with at Sage S was, how do we make sure that we infuse the value of innovation and also give permission for innovation at every level of our organization and every part of our organization? And one of the ways that we realized that we could really engage in it was from the work of McKinsey and Company around moving fast. And so there are these parts of moving fast through innovation that need to be in place for all levels of the organization. And so we started to change our structure of our organization during COVID in order to be able to be an organization that moved fast through innovation, and also encouraged everyone to feel that they had not just the permission to engage in innovation, but also the obligation and accountability to engage in innovation. And so what that looked like for us was a few things. The first was rethinking the ways of working. And so part of what we did is we delegated decision making. And so decision making, as much as possible, lies with the person that is as closest to the decision as possible and as closest to the event that they need to make a decision about as possible. So if there's a frontline change on an intake form that needs to be innovated, or a programmatic change that needs to be looked at, I'm not the one that's making the decision. It's the frontline staff who is as close to that decision as possible that's making that. The other thing is that we tried as much as possible to build as much capacity as possible within our staff so that they have execution excellence, that they know what it looks like to actually be able to look at a decision, realize that a decision needs to be made, and then knows how to implement those changes that the decision leads to. And then the other part is we talk about extraordinary partnerships. And I think that this goes back to the work of Simon Sinek and Worthy Rivals, because those extraordinary partnerships are partnerships both amongst our staff, but also partnerships in our sector. And I think that they're both extraordinary partnerships that push us to be better than we are. I always think about my son who had a good friend when he was in school, and the two of them always competed for the best grade. That was a worthy rival relationship in which they were very close. They motivated each other, they cheered each other on, but they also encouraged each other to excellence. And so I think that those are what extraordinary partnerships are. And I also think we have to think about extraordinary partnerships as extraordinary, outside of the ordinary. Sometimes you need to partner with someone that you didn't imagine that you should be partnering with in order to get the work done. The second thing that we did was we reimagined the structure. And so part of what we tried to do, as I talked about, was to flatten the decision-making structure. We also put a lot of responsibility and accountability and decision-making opportunities within each of our teams who were as close to the work as possible. And we engaged in what our operations director calls radical hybrid work. And so what that meant is that we really let people figure out where the best location for them to be to get their work done was. That work is an activity and a mindset, not a location, and to engage in that. And that actually, I think, also allowed us to become more successful as a provincial organization. And I think also allowed us to do what we recently did, which was to expand into Saskatchewan. And the last is we talked about reshaping talent. And what reshaping talent means is recognizing leadership and leadership opportunities at every part of our organization. And also to rethink, what does leadership mean? I am in leadership of the organization, and that I hold a lot of accountability for a lot of things around due diligence and financial things and risk management, but I'm probably not the clinical leader because I don't know most about those pieces of work. And I'm not the business services leader because I don't know most about those pieces of work. And so I think it's about really making space for leadership at every part of your organization. And then the last is, there's a great quote, and I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something about how the future is going to be, by Eric Hoffer, the future is going to be held by people who know how to learn, not the learned. And so how do we teach people how to learn, not to rely on what they learned?
One of the other things that we often talk about at Sage and that I think has been really impactful in our innovation, our ability to actually engage in innovative work and to have this both as a framework and as a decision-making tool, is that pulling from the work of Malcolm Gladwell and the idea of thin slicing. So taking all of the knowledge, the expertise, the capacity that we have, and being able to make decisions with that sort of thin sliver of information, recognizing that we could get way, way, way more information, and maybe at some point we will fill in some of those gaps, but that if we trust in our ability to sort of balance in this intrinsic thinking, this deliberative work, we can allow ourselves, actually, I think it goes to the moving fast piece that Andrea was just talking about. And it allows us to step into things possibly earlier than we would if we were working from a more sort of traditional design or research perspective. And so when I think about thin slicing, I often think about what happened for us at the beginning of COVID. As Andrea mentioned, we moved very, very quickly. And we moved so quickly, in fact, that I said to the team on the first day of COVID, you have a week to figure out how to deliver programs online. And go figure it out, come back to me in a week. We're going to talk about this. Within 2 weeks, I want us to be delivering programs online. And because of our innovation mindset, because our staff were prepared for that, they were able to do that. And so we took everything that we knew and we distilled it down, and we said, okay, I think we have enough of a framework that we can try this. And so from a thin slicing perspective, we didn't have all of the information. We knew we didn't have all of the information, but we had enough to be able to step over the line and to start that out. And then as we went, we absolutely learned things, but we had enough to know that we could do this without causing harm. And that the only way we were going to find out more information was to wait for somebody else to do it and to tell us, or to do it ourselves and to learn the things as we went, which I think feels like an uncomfortable sort of idea or place to be in, but for us has been really, really foundational. And one of the things that I often think about also when I think about thin slicing and Malcolm Gladwell is that, you know, he's revisited this work recently and said, here are all of the things that I got wrong. And here's all of the things that I have learned. And so I appreciate that as an innovative thinker, the ability to also come back and say, sometimes I don't get all of these things right. And here's what I've put out that I would actually say differently now, which I think is really valuable and I think really important to be thinking about in terms of that work. One of the other things that we talk about at SageS often when we're talking about innovation and we're talking about, comes out of thin slicing, I think, is our ability to look at how do we engage in work that has a distinction from evidence informed or best practice, right? How do we look at the work that we do? And I often feel like for myself, so much of my work is about this balanced line between what is it that research tells us, what is it that we know, how do we pull from all of the historical knowledge capacity, all of the work of amazing researchers. Many of you are, are on the call. I see lots of names of people that I have worked with before who are doing amazing research. How do we look at that? But also, how do we look at what is the best new innovative practice? What is the things that we actually don't have peer-reviewed evidence about, but we actually are seeing these results that are happening in community. We're seeing this forward progress and research perspective versus our sort of best practice model, which often is backwards looking and takes so much time and so much money and energy that it restricts and it removes people from being able to engage in that practice of best practice research. And what does it mean then within our organization to be somebody who can do both, who can engage both as researchers ourselves, who can engage in both evidence-informed and best practice research, but also as people who do design and who come up with new programs and initiatives and way of engaging in communities. How do we inform ourselves within both of those spaces and utilize both of those opportunities and categories for information in the work that we do, and how do we encourage funders to be more open to that as a possibility and as an opportunity, so that we're not being limited by these are the things that have been published versus these are the things that actually are happening in community and are really effective and really grounding.
I think that often where this work leads us is to the minimum viable product, which is a terrifying word in our sector. The R&D departments in for-profit organizations often talk about a minimum viable product. And it means that we're trying to experiment and see if what we have is the right thing so that we can iterate to get to the right thing. And I think often there's this perception in our sector that the minimum viable product is going to harm human beings and that we're going to put them in danger. And I think that we have to be able to move away from that and to recognize that our minimum viable product actually comes from a lot of knowledge that we already have and also comes from thin slicing. And unless we engage in a lean experimentation process, we're never going to be able to get to an evolution of where we want to get to really begin to solve and address those irretractable problems.
Yeah, and I think that if we think about it from this sort of perspective of what does it mean to show up in that place, all of these things that we've talked about in terms of feedback, in terms of thin slicing, moving fast, it all comes together and has to be incorporated all together. It can't, I can't just thin slice a bunch of things and then be like, oh, I figured it out. Now we're going to go and that's what we're going to do, and not be open to the feedback of you did, you made this decision and actually it's the wrong thing. It's not working. It's not what people want or need in community, right? We can't decide that we're going to move fast and be really purposeful in that forward movement as an organization if we're not also willing to look at what is the research that comes behind and why are things designed in the way that they are that helps us to then step into what that next step and those next conversations could look like or should look like. And so for me, all of this kind of comes together into this experimentation process. And again, if we think about innovation as that mindset, if we go in with that capacity to sit in whatever those values are, for us, some of those values, like I said before, for me, one of those values is trusting in the messiness. If I engage in it from that place and that understanding of what it looks like and feels like for me as a human, and therefore also understand that my team, that the people that I'm working with are also going to have their own experience of that, their own human experience of that. So I can hold space for that, and hold opportunity to process through and engage in that. Then it allows us to start to just make shifts in terms of how we engage, what we do, how we think about the issues that we're trying to solve, and what is the future space that we're trying to create within our work. And that brings us to our space and opportunity for questions.
Thank you both so much for such a wonderful presentation. For anyone who wants to add questions, the Q&A is open. Please feel free. Let's see if I can pin myself as well. Oh, so, I'm off camera. So I'm trying to figure out the pinning. There we go. So a question that comes to mind for me, it started with the discussion Carrie, you and I were having at the beginning before the webinar started. Maybe it will get kind of the Q&A going, but what does innovation look like in a time of recession?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I don't know that I have an answer because I think it's definitely something that we are struggling with and thinking about a lot ourselves right now. I think that, so my whole job, my whole existence here at Sages is really driven by that idea of being the innovative person, the person that's coming up with new ideas, that's reading, that's thinking, that all of that. And I find myself more recently feeling in scarcity mindset than I ever have before, which is a really interesting experience for me, to stop and really think about what are the ways, like how quick and easy is it to get into scarcity mindset when you're in a time of recession, when you're in a time of so much is unknown. And part of what I've been thinking about is what felt different in COVID than what feels, than it feels currently. Because I think in COVID, we didn't engage in a scarcity mindset. We engaged in a mindset of recognizing that I can actually remember this really clearly. I was traveling when COVID hit. When we sort of, the talk about lockdowns started to happen, I was in Canada, but I was in a different province. And I remember calling Andrea and we were having a conversation and I was like, I should get home. And she was like, you should get home because we don't know if they're going to close provincial borders. Right. And that we had this whole planning conversation. At the end of the conversation, I said to her, things are about to get way worse for our clients. And she said, yep. And I went, great. And then we hung up the phone. Really depressing conversation. But I think that we knew when we went into COVID how much our clients and our work was going to be impacted by it, and that we felt this real responsibility to do as much as we possibly could to prevent the negative impact from our clients. And so there's something that I think for me about this moving into a recession that is, maybe it's the piece of the fact that it's cumulative, that we've now lived through COVID and we didn't really come out, even though we kind of talked about coming out, and we talked about, the funding of COVID has dried up, but the client experience of COVID is still very, very prevalent, or the number of clients or the level of need. But there's something also that I think our tolerance for the unknown is a little bit worn out as humans in general right now. That feels different as we move into this sort of this phase of recession and unknown. And I think that, for me, the thing that kind of helps me to ground. So, Andrea talked about it when we talked about Candy McStone. So having people, having a person, having a team, having people that support you even when you feel like, oh my God, we just need to like pack up shop and make ourselves tiny and small so that nobody can hurt us through this time. And we're just gonna, fly under the radar until better times come. Having a team of people that inspire you helps to go, well, actually, what are we going to miss if we don't do that? Right? What are the opportunities that don't exist when we have that? And having people that you can say, I feel really scared right now. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do this. And sometimes, I was recently having a conversation with a colleague who lives in the US and a colleague who lives in Scotland. And, we were talking about, we didn't have answers for each other, but the ability to recognize that that feeling was a universal feeling, that we all felt it, that we could go to each other and say, I don't know what to do and I don't know how to do this. And I feel like I'm not sure how to be in innovation right now is helpful, even just in the idea of I get to feel like I'm not alone. And therefore it takes away some of that scarcity feeling of like, I just need to stop doing it. Cause you go, well, actually, there's lots of people who are doing innovation right now that are feeling this same thing. How do we come together and recognize that what we do and how we do it might change, right? That a percentage of our budget that can go to it might have to change. But if we have this as a mindset, if we have this as a way of being, that doesn't have to change. Even if we can do less fun projects, or we can take on less interesting research, or we can look at different opportunities because we don't have the same kind of money that can dedicate to it. If we've created this framework where that's the perspective that we start with, that doesn't have to go away. And we can keep that and we can ensure that as we weather through this, that we keep that because it's going to make it easier and stronger when we come out of a recession to be where we want to be versus if we stop doing it altogether and I say, fine, I'm just going to become the director of programs and I'm just going to do programmatic things and that's the only perspective I'm going to have, then when we come out of this recession space, we're going to be in a totally different mindset and we're going to have forgotten about this thing that we're trying to actually do and this future that we're trying to actually create. The other thing that I've been thinking about, sorry, I'll just,
I think from
one more
a
thing to
skills and values perspective is that the one we need to sit in the most right now is vulnerability.
Yeah. Whew, that sucks.
Yeah. But I think that's it. I think
favorite.
that we need to, yeah, exactly. I know that. Me too. But I think that right now that there's a question in the chat of how do you comfort everyone who's uncomfortable with change? I think that that's where we're at right now societally. We're in this massive place of change. And the answer is we don't actually, and we can't actually comfort anyone. All we can do is to create resilience and capacity to sit in the discomfort and hopefully some community so that someone is sitting in the discomfort, holding hands with you. There's a great video by Brene Brown about the difference between empathy and sympathy. And, empathy is like, I'm sitting here with you in the discomfort that you're experiencing. Whereas sympathy is, hey, want a sandwich while you're experiencing whatever you're experiencing? And so I think that that's really what this is about. It's about recognizing that actually, even if we're putting on a face and it looks like we're fine with the change, we're not. I'm not fine with anything that's going on right now. I am incredibly scared and depressed and stressed out. But I think to be able to be vulnerable, and also I keep thinking it's my fault, whatever's going wrong, right? Because I think that we're so used to internalizing, I think, especially as leaders, we are. And so I think that is all a very, very vulnerable process. And we have to be able to sit in that vulnerability and encourage other people to sit in the discomfort of that with us.
I also think that when we're thinking about things like change and people who are uncomfortable with change, part of what we often talk about or point out is that change exists whether you're comfortable with it or not, right? And so how do we encourage people to take back some of their power within that idea of change? I've talked about the trust and the messiness and how I love that. I love that value. When we created those values, our office manager at the time said, I would like to clean up the messiness. I would like that to be the value. I don't like that. I want to manage it. I want to organize it. But she talked about she said, I can trust in it because I trust in you guys, and I trust that the change is going to happen. And if I can connect into that and recognize the parts of it that I have tolerance for and the parts of it that I don't, and the spaces where I'm giving up my power or my opportunity to do something or to say something because I say, well, I don't like change. Great. Some of us don't like change. There's lots of things though that, change all the time. And so what are these spaces and opportunities to take back some of that when we recognize that actually change is going to happen, whether we like it or not?
I noticed that we're at 107, but there is one really good question also in the chat, which is what kind of evidence do you think is enough to tell you when something is working? And I think that this is, it's such a hard place to sit in, because I think that part of what we have had to do in order to make sure that we have enough evidence is to build really robust ways of getting feedback, really robust ways of getting information. Partnering, we talked about those, partnerships, partnering with researchers and collaborating with people who are also in the field to really understand what is the evidence that we're looking for to understand if something is working or not working, and how do we really quickly determine that so that we can innovate or iterate quickly or change something if it's not. Carrie's team has I think it's 12 points for your innovation plan, the innovation process, right? There's a 12-point innovation process. And I would suggest that each point could actually be another 15 points within it. Innovation is not just this, let's throw it all up in the air and see where it lands. It's actually a very thoughtful, organized, step-by-step process. And I feel like that's like a whole other webinar of like, how do we do that and what does it look like? But I think it's just important to note that it's not a throw it up in the air and wait for it all to come down, that it's actually a very organized, well thought out, looking for the measurements to understand where do we innovate and where do we iterate.
And I think that when we're thinking about, evidence, even the idea of sort of the what is evidence, what is enough evidence, like all of that becomes really challenging from the perspective of what I might think is really important might not fit for somebody else, right? They might look at it from a different kind of perspective. And so how do we hold space for that? And one of the things that I often think about is that at the end of the day, the most important indicator that I have is the communities and the individuals that we work with. And that those communities and individuals are not a homogenous group. So part of what might happen is that I might have evidence that this new program that we run works really, really well within rural communities, but I might also have evidence at the same time that it does not work in urban communities. And so I have to sit in that sort of taking of the most important thing that I can learn is from the people who are engaged in our programs or the communities that we're working with. Because ultimately, and this is, I talk about my tipping point. Part of my tipping point was realizing that ultimately I am actually the least important voice in this space. And the most important space is those clients and those communities that we're working with. And so I might say, well, there's really strong evidence that this program works really well within these spaces. And if rural communities say, and they have said to me before, I don't care, I'm not going to do that. That doesn't meet the needs that I have. This is actually the thing that I have and the need that I have. And so in some ways, our conversations around evidence and how do we know is enough we have to be open and adaptive enough that what I think is the right answer or what Sarah thinks is the right answer as a academic researcher might be totally thrown out the window based off of what we're hearing from the clients and the people that we're engaged with. I think, Sarah, am I correct that we still have time? Like we're
Yeah, absolutely. We have about 20 more minutes, so
Okay,
please.
perfect. Oh, okay. I don't know why I thought it was going till 1.
No, we've got more time.
timed ourselves to actually have questions, which is why you were surprised because we normally don't time ourselves to have questions.
I think this discussion is so perfect that I'm glad you have time for questions. So, since we do have more time, Nicole did ask, what would be your greatest success so far? Thinking about all the work you've done.
Wow.
Geez, Nicole, thanks for the softball question. Um, uh, so
I
I
feel
think that
very, oh, go ahead, Carrie.
we're not very coordinated today.
No, we aren't.
I
We're
I
usually
think
better at this.
our greatest success is, so I'm gonna, maybe is gonna be sort of cheesy. I mean, there's lots of programmatic things that we could talk about. There's lots of policy things that we could talk about that I'm super, super proud of. I think our greatest success is that I've been with the organization for 12 years and we are not the same organization we were when I joined. And part of that is just natural evolution and growth. But I think that our ability to look at what is different in our communities, what is different from, in 12 years, a lot has changed. And so, what do we know? What have we learned? How has that changed what we deliver, who we deliver it to, who our client base is, how we think about things? I think for me, that feels like the greatest sign of the greatest success is that we are shifting and adapting on an ongoing basis to say, well, what about this new thing that we haven't thought about before, or this new client base that we haven't thought about before? And that from that work, we've built new programs and new initiatives. That we have a Real Talk program that works with informal supporters because one time Andrea and I were talking and said, who else, who do people talk to? Because they don't talk to us, right? Or we have a program dedicated to women at the intersection of sex work and domestic abuse because we recognize that actually, if we only talk about these things in isolation, we remove the opportunity for people to be together and to share their whole experience. So all of those things I think are great successes, but they all come out of our ability to ask a question or to notice something or to see shifts and changes and then be fluid and adaptive with that and follow that path down the line. I don't know, Andrea, what you were going to say.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Like I definitely agree with you that one of our greatest successes is the fact that we're adaptive, right? That we aren't the same organization that I started with, that you started with. And one of the things we say, we have a fairly younger staff, so we have a lot of mat leaves or paternity leaves. And so we often say to people when they go on leave, don't expect to come back to the same organization that you left, because hopefully we are adapting and we are meeting the needs and it looks different. But I think that maybe for me, I feel very proud of the culture that we've created that allows us to be in that place, to sit in the discomfort of the change, to encourage people to engage in ways that hopefully allow them to show up in their true selves, in their vulnerability. I'm so very cognizant of the fact that, say, Jess, or any workplace, we hold a lot of responsibility because people spend, at least 8 hours of their day, which is often the majority of their sort of doing something part of their day in an environment. And I'm hoping that that environment is both helping, I know this sounds also cheesy, society to become a better place, but also the human being to feel like they are a more whole human being. I have lots of beliefs around the role that attachment plays in society and the role that attachment plays in our own human success. And I think that we can't separate the individual's experience of secure attachment and psychological safety from the experience of society's success as a whole, because I think that they're intertwined. And so I think that for me, maybe one of the biggest successes is that we've really tried to live those values, to recognize that the personal is political. And so therefore we really have to operate from, I feel like so jargony in this moment, but that the personal is political and we have to really operate from that perspective. I think I also feel really proud of our board of directors. Our board of directors has held a tremendous amount of risk over the years and often stepped off of a ledge that I think most board of directors would not be willing to, and be really generative in that. And it doesn't mean that it's been an easy journey. Sometimes there's been very explosive things that have happened along the way. But I don't think if we wouldn't have had that sort of board of directors that any of the other things would have happened. What would have happened is all of the great staff that have all of these great values would have just gone to another great organization. And so I think that that also has to be recognized. And, I think that we can't underplay the importance of that. And I think we also can't underplay how damaging bad leadership can be in our sector, and that we have some actually systemic problems around how we're structured as societies that can potentially lead to those things.
That's so well said. And I don't think it's jargony when it's deeply true. That's one of my
I
favorite.
mean, I would like to point out that it took her an hour and 15 minutes before she talked about attachment, which might be a record.
Is that unusual?
That
Yeah,
is
usually
very
it's way
unusual.
earlier.
Let's see, we have a couple more great questions. In attendee notes, I appreciate the conversation here. I was sitting with the thought, how learning usually is the outcome of any research across disciplines. What is your hope and vision for some other outcomes?
I mean, I think community-based action research, I think, part of what AVA is engaged in is that hopefully it's not just learning for the sake of learning, it's learning so that it propels society forward and so that we use those learnings and build on those learnings. I also hope that learning leads us to a place of thought experiments, the what ifs and what if it looked different and what if we turned it all on its head. I think that part of what academia gets to engage in that we don't on the ground is those thought experiments, because there's the space and the time to do that. And so I hope that learning also leads us to that we often talk about the bad cops versus the good cops in from a research perspective. That good cops, they let the evidence lead them to wherever it is, and then the crime is whatever it was based on whatever the evidence is. Whereas bad cops, they look for the evidence to fit the crime. And I think that what I want the outcome of research to be is the good cop. I want us just to follow the evidence to wherever it leads us, and where it leads us might be a very shocking and uncomfortable place, but that's okay. Then let's work from there and develop whatever responses we need.
Yeah, and I think that, we spend so much time, we have such a unique perspective because we are that community-based organization. We are on the ground. We have staff who are doing frontline service delivery work on a regular basis, as well as being an organization that does prevention work and does, large scale social change initiatives and backbones and stuff like that, as well as then the research and the innovation and development work that Andrea and I do. And I think that through that, we have this sort of lens of and a learning is only as good as the paper it's on until you figure out what implementation means around that. And so really for me, the sort of hope and vision for outcomes is to be able to actually really get clear and get purposeful about those implementation pieces that come from the learning, right? How do we learn things and then from that learning implement something and then learn it and then learn something new and then implement that and then learn something new and then implement that? Because if we're in it for the sake of learning, and it goes to what Andrea was saying with the quote from Eric Hoffer. I was like, it's offer, but I couldn't remember what the first letter was. From Eric Hoffer about the world will be inherited by learners, not the learned. And so I think for me, the hope and vision is that we create more spaces for people to be learners so that we can connect into what is all of these outcomes that we're getting and learning about, and then what does that mean and what do we do with it?
So well said. And I know, Andrea, you sit in a very unique position where you do you've been involved in frontline work and direct service and innovation practice, but you also do a little bit of the academic work as well. How does that impact your view on things like research, having seen both sides?
So I think I struggle with the academic part of my life because I think that, or I struggle more with it, because I I see how easy it is to just get engaged in the research and get lost in the research and delve into the research. And I'm as guilty of it as anybody else is, because it is so very satisfying and so very interesting. And especially if you're someone that's like inclined that way, the rabbit holes that one could go down and the research that one could engage in, it's fascinating. But I think that part of what I always try to stay really grounded in my work is two things. One is that research for research sake, or research for publication's sake, or research for academia's sake, how is that really contributing to the world? You know, I always love a quote that comes from a second century rabbi, which is, you know, it's not our job to finish the work, but we're not free to desist from it. So how am I engaged in it? And then the other part is part of the research that I have done is in my academic career is research with human beings. And although there's these really strict ethical guidelines and you have to be really careful about how you're working with the human beings that we work with, what all human beings that I've interviewed, all the people that I've interviewed or have worked with want to know is, what are you doing with the information that I'm giving you? How is this going to contribute to new net knowledge, and hopefully nobody finding themselves, if they're a victim, in the position that I was in, or if they're a service provider, to make service provision better. And so I think that we have a real obligation as academics to honor the fact that people are giving us their time, their talent, their ideas, and that we do something with it to create new net knowledge that hopefully starts to address and look at those irretractable issues.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good lesson for I think all academics to learn and researchers to learn is there an impact or an outcome beyond just extracting data from people about their own lived experiences? Okay, we have one more question coming in, and it says, oh, it's a three-parter. How do we create this energy in so many other organizations in Canada? Is there a culture of change needed everywhere? Are there right or wrong incentives?
I'm going to take the middle question first, which is is there a culture change needed everywhere? And I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to say that not from a place of educated, I know everywhere and I know all of those sort of perspectives, but I think that, you know, in the work that I've done, I have met so many amazing service providers and academics from across the country. But I think that we all have these spaces and these opportunities where we get sort of stuck into the bubble of what we do and what we have done and how we practice. But I do know that there is innovative pockets of work, ideas, practices happening everywhere. And so I don't think it's as much of a culture change of we all need to stop exactly what we're doing and switch, but I think it is about understanding and recognizing and tapping into where those opportunities exist, who's doing that kind of work, and creating opportunities, creating these sort of spaces for that network to grow and to expand. I think is probably some of the first steps in terms of how do you create this energy, right? I often, you know, I have amazing, great colleagues here in Calgary and across Alberta, where our organization is rooted. But I have amazing, great colleagues all over the place, which allows me then to connect into what are they doing, what's going on. You're not set in the structure of this political climate that I'm in, or this social experience that is happening in Alberta. And so I can ask you something outside of that and we can get those perspectives. And so I think some of that helps that energy to kind of grow and to change. And then I'm going to go to the last question, which is there right or wrong incentives? I like to bug my team and say there is no right or wrong answer, but there is a correct one. But I think the thing that comes up for me when I think about this question is innovation, initiatives, growth, change that is driven by funding, I would suggest is not the right one. Innovation, change, shifts, culture adjustments that is driven by community, by individuals, by the people that we're working with, by the organizations and the people within our organizations, I think are the right incentives. And so I think that for me is often something that's challenging to look at, especially because, you know, even in times not in recession, we are underfunded, under resourced, all of these things. But one of the greatest strengths that I think that we have as an organization is that we don't apply for anything and everything. We sometimes say that's actually just that's not the right incentive to start doing this work or to start thinking about this. It doesn't apply for us. And so I think that for me is sort of my easy answer to what I'm sure the much more complex sort of right or wrong. But that's the place that I start with.
I think for me, looking at it from like a very pragmatic place of what are the incentives and how do you encourage change at all sorts of different levels. I think that what we need to do is actually begin with creating a structure of incentives. There currently are no incentives, right? And I think that
Or
that
there's
is the problem.
disincentives.
Or there's disincentives. And I think that that's part of the problem within itself. You know, many years ago, the UK, not the UK, the Australian government, when they were giving out contracts for domestic violence programming for a period of time, all domestic violence programming was accompanied with research dollars. And that led, I think, to innovation in their sector because those research dollars were there and there was research networks and there was time and space and ability to engage in it. And that's a really good way to incentivize through changing a system innovation. But then the government changed and then it got taken away and not only got it taken away, then also the programs got cut. So I think that, you know, and now everyone, at least our colleagues in Australia, feel very disincentivized and they also feel very lacking in energy. And so I think that whatever incentives we build in, they have to be incentives that are not, you know, that aren't vulnerable to the winds of change, and are actually like built in our way of being in the same way that our ethics are built into our way of being as, you know, social workers or psychologists or whatever sort of service provider we are. There's almost a part of me that feels like, you know, I'm a registered social worker, and so I'm bound by the Alberta College of Social Workers standards, ethical, you know, ethics of practice. Why isn't one of our standards of practice that we have to be engaging in innovation? Because I actually think that that's as important and as much an ethical imperative as any of the other things that we should be engaged in. And then how do we create energy? I think by, again, another, you know, slogan, but being the change we want to see, right? I think that we don't create energy. What we do is we inspire energy. And I think that part of why Carrie and I wrote this book is we want to, you know, inspire people and share with them. And hopefully they're willing to like pick it up. And, you know, we think we're really funny and we think we're smart and we think that we like, you know, have a perspective that might be worth sharing. But but we might not be. But if we're not the people, then hopefully someone else will inspire, right? But whatever it is, I think that we should be seeking inspiration and sharing inspiration. I think that that's how you create energy.
That was so beautifully said, both of you. And I think that's the perfect way sort of to wrap up the conversation. We have a minute left. We got through all the questions. So just my deepest gratitude to both of you for sharing your time and your expertise and your important work with us. It's so, so wonderful to have conversations like this and to be able to broadcast this knowledge out into the world. So thank you both so much.
Thank you
Thank
so much
you.
for this opportunity. And please go and get our book.
You can count on that. I will for sure.
Thanks, everyone.